We are continuing our series on Journey Life, lessons from Old Testament people of faith. And I can't tell you how excited I am about the book and the character that we're going to next. We're going to be looking for the next several weeks at the Old Testament character Daniel. And he is one of my favorite characters of the Old Testament. And by the way, the book of Daniel is one of the most important books of the Old Testament. I was talking to Brother Bobby Abney this morning, and I experienced much the same thing he did. Growing up, we were New Testament Christians. And so because of that emphasis, we tended to shy away from the Old Testament, and we hurt ourselves in doing that. Because the Old Testament is truly the New Testament concealed, and the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. And so much of Daniel is about us. In fact, I'll be talking about that here in just a moment. Now, if you grew up going to church, you've probably heard some of the stories about Daniel. You know, Daniel in the lion's den. Or Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. I mean, you've heard these stories that as kids, you know, we were enthralled by. But the book of Daniel is so much more than that. Now, if you read through the book of Daniel, you'll probably walk away scratching your head, wondering, okay, I get the first part. What in the world's going on in the latter part? Now, I would love to tell you I'm going to answer all those questions in this series. I'm not. But we will touch on it as we go through. But one of the things that's important is understanding how the book of Daniel is designed. And I want to introduce that first thing this morning. When you look at the book of Daniel, the first thing you need to realize is that it is designed in a beautiful way to convey its message. For instance, chapter 1 is the introduction to the book. Introduces you to Daniel. Tells you what's going on in his life. Tells you what's going on in the life of Israel or Judah as the people of God. Okay? So you have this introduction. And then what follows is 6 chapters of couplets. And what I mean by couplets is that you have 6 chapters where you have 2 chapters all the way through those 6 that mirror one another. For instance, chapter 2 is the first of the visions, of the dreams, of the revelation of God. And in this particular case, the dream happens to Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 2 is followed by chapter 3, which is the first test. Now, you have a small test that we'll look at in chapter 1, but this is the first big test. And it involves a fiery furnace and 3 of Daniel's friends. And you're like, yeah, I've heard of that test. Well, it's a test. And we'll look at what it's a test of here in a moment. Chapter 4 is a chapter of arrogance. It's about a king who thinks he's everything. I mean, he is the Savior of the world. And God says, no, you're not. And it's a story about God, how he humbled him and how he repented of his arrogance. Now, 4 is followed by chapter 5. It's the second story of arrogance. This is also a king of Babylon. God also sets out to humble him, but he doesn't repent. And the end result was disaster. So, 2 equal stories. Chapter 6 is your second test. Chapter 3 is Daniel's 3 friends. Chapter 6 is Daniel and what happened to him as he got older in life. And then the chapter 7 is the second vision. This time a vision that Daniel has. And it sets up the rest of the book. I mean, these visions are all about the future. And it goes on to chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10, chapter 11, chapter 12, which ends with the resurrection of the dead at the end of time. And so it's just a magnificent way of designing the book to help you understand what's going on in the book. Now, today's lesson comes down to one very simple question. If you don't learn anything else from the lesson today, please take home with you the answer to this question, because chapter 1 and the entire book is basically asking this question: where is your identity found? Now, we all have identities. And notice I use plural. I mean, you can go around the room if, somebody came up to me and said, tell me about yourself. Well, I'm from Mississippi. That's part of my identity. I am one of 4 children, part of my identity. My last name is Chapman, which means a tradesperson. If you go back to ancient England, that's what the name Chapman means, a trade person. I'm married to June. We've been married 45 years. We have 2 sons. I've got 3 grandsons, 2 wonderful daughter-in-laws. I mean, I'm a preacher. We all have these identities. You can be identified by where you went to school, where you were born, the family you were raised in, the job that you have. I mean, the children that you have, the grandchildren. I mean, how many of us like to talk about our grandchildren, right? Part of our identity. And so our identity is multifaceted. But what the book of Daniel is about the core identity. What is your core identity? And the whole story of Christianity is about calling people back to how God created us, to our core identity. Where is your identity found? The answer of the book of Daniel is in God. I mean, that's it. And so, y'all, let's say the question together and then answer it together. Read with me. Where is your identity found? And the answer, in God. And that's what we need to remember as we work through this text. So let's jump in. Daniel chapter 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, this kind of sets the time frame. We're in the early 600s BC. Judah is the only part of Israel left. The northern kingdom's already been carried off into captivity and basically have disappeared. Few remnants left, but not a lot, who become the Samaritans. And so Judah is what's left, and Judah is on the verge of exile herself. The Babylonians have come to power. You basically look at a map, and Nebuchadnezzar's dad had developed this Babylonian kingdom. He basically joined with the Median Empire, which is to the east of Babylon, and they overthrew the Assyrians. The Assyrians had been the primary power for a long, long time. And these 2 forces joined together, overthrew the Assyrians, and Babylon basically took over the entire Fertile Crescent. I mean, everything, this is modern-day Iraq. You go on up and you get, of course, the Saudi Arabian desert. You go on up into Syria. You go into Lebanon and then down into what is today modern Israel. And Babylon had basically taken over all of that. And the reason they had taken over Judah is that they had gone down and taken on the Egyptians. The Egyptians was the other powerhouse at the time. And Babylon went in there and just destroyed them. Egypt would never rise again. It was the end of the Egyptian empire. And so here is Judah, and they're faced with this powerful kingdom, the most powerful kingdom of that time. And Nebuchadnezzar has come in. And basically what ends up happening is the Babylonians end up taking Judah into captivity in 3 waves. Okay? And so in 605, after whipping the Egyptians, Nebuchadnezzar came toward Jerusalem, besieged it, and the people in Jerusalem put the white flag up. I mean, they didn't even fight. They're like, okay, what do you need? You need money, you need silver, you go. Tell us, Nebuchadnezzar, what you want. And that's when he carries off Daniel and his 3 friends, along with a lot of other people. Okay, we'll look at that here in a moment. About 8 years later, Israel kind of rebels again. Judah decides, you know what, we're tired of sending taxes to Babylon. Maybe we can just break free. And they tried to rebel again. Nebuchadnezzar came back. And he said, oh no, you're mine. And don't you forget it. And he hauls away a whole bunch more. This time Ezekiel goes. Ezekiel wrote the book of Ezekiel. He ends up in Babylon, along with a lot of the Jews. And then a few years later, about 11 years later, in 586 BC, they rebel a 3rd time. And I don't know about y'all, but when June counts to 3, I don't cross that line. I don't know if y'all have ever experienced that. You know, I'll be asking her something, or we'll be arguing about something, and she'll say, I've counted to 3. And I'm like, oh, no, not 3. Good night. You know, and the third time was it for Judah. Nebuchadnezzar came back, destroyed the city. I don't know if you've been watching what's going on over in the Middle East with Gaza and Israel and Lebanon. I mean, it's just nothing but destruction. And that's what Nebuchadnezzar did. Set fire to Solomon's temple. The temple that had been there for 400 years. And it burns completely down. And everything is wiped out. And the only things left is the poor and the old. Everybody else is carried to Babylon. And so that's what's going on. Daniel is living through all of this. Except he's over in Babylon. Because he goes in the first wave. And so in 605 BC, Daniel's probably 15 years old. Daniel is a member of the royal family. He is a descendant of David. He is highly educated. He is a good-looking guy. I mean, he's coming up through the ranks of the very best that Judah had to offer. And in comes the Babylonians. And so chapter 1, verse 2 says, And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylon and put them in the treasure house of his God. This was very common in the ancient world. You sack somebody's temple, you take their gold, their silver, you carry it to your temple. Nebuchadnezzar does that. And that's going to come back and haunt his grandson at the end. But he does it anyway. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of the court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Nebuchadnezzar was a smart man. And he's conquering all of these different kingdoms, all these different cultures. How do you manage that? How do you rule over all of these different kingdoms that Nebuchadnezzar is conquering? And Nebuchadnezzar's answer to that question is, you take their young people, their young men, you get them when they're 15, 16, 17 years old, and you bring them back to Babylon, and you turn them into Babylonians. That's what you do. And then you have the ability to have someone who understands not just their culture, but they understand your culture. And once they become full-fledged Babylonians, they can then go and help, rule these countries that Babylon has conquered. By the way, it's what we do here in America. I don't know if y'all ever notice. I doubt seriously that we may have a few in here. I doubt seriously many of us are indigenous Americans. I did my DNA, and when my DNA came back, I was 1% American Indian. Which means I had one ancestor a long time ago that was evidently an American Indian. And, and most of us are like that. But if we trace our history, most of us are not from America. I mean, I'm basically Scottish, English, Irish, a little bit of German. Some of y'all are probably French, maybe Italian. We go all the way around the world. We got people from Asia. We got people from Africa. I mean, America is a country made up of people from all over the world. Nebuchadnezzar was turning Babylon into that. And so he had taken these young men and he was going to indoctrinate them in the Babylonian culture. Now, Babylon was an incredible city. I mean, Babylon is like growing up in Ripley, Mississippi and moving to Nashville, Tennessee. All right? I mean, when you come from a town that has 2 red lights and you move to Nashville, by the way, how many red lights did y'all have to come through to come to church today? I mean, from my house in Madison, I believe there's like 15 of them. And by the way, you catch that Sunday where all of them are on red, and it will test your Christian faith. You're like, good night. How many red lights have I got to stop at? And I remember moving to Nashville and thinking, I used to get home in 5 minutes from anywhere in town. Now I can't get anywhere in 5 minutes. I mean, I can't even get my car cranked out of the parking lot in 5 minutes. I mean, well, Babylon was like that. Babylon was the city of the ancient world, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Nebuchadnezzar is going to build a city that is so beautiful, known for its hanging gardens. And by the way, the Euphrates River came and literally encircled the city, creating this giant moat around the city so that armies couldn't attack it. And then they used it for their freeway system in order to basically get on a boat and head wherever you needed to in the city of Babylon. It was one of the amazing things of the ancient world. So if you can imagine Daniel being brought as he's a slave, but he's not a slave. He's going to go into the king's service, but he's not doing it willfully. And imagine him showing up and seeing the city of Babylon. You know, it blew his mind. Daniel 1 verse 3 in the voice, though, you need to see this. After the king returned home, he commanded Ashpenaz, chief of the royal eunuchs. That's the literal translation. Now, the word can mean just a royal official, but it also can mean a eunuch. And of course, a eunuch is a man who is no longer a man who's been robbed of his ability to have children. And they're to bring some of the Israelites who have been taken in captivity to the palace. These included members of Judah's royal family and nobility. And what I think a lot of us miss is a verse that's found in the book of 2 Kings, also in the book of Isaiah. And some of your descendants, Hezekiah. This is a couple of generations before this. And God had said to Hezekiah, because he had basically said to the Babylonians, look how great and rich I am. And God said, really, Hezekiah? You think you're the reason you're rich and famous? Some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, who will be born to you, in other words, your grandsons, your great-grandsons, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. You go read Josephus, and Josephus says that's Daniel and his 3 friends. If it's not, we have nowhere this is fulfilled in the Old Testament. Now, can I 100% prove this? No. Do I believe it's what happened? Yes. I didn't, Rodney, ask you where your view on that was. I know people are mixed on this. But what you see going on when you see it is you see them taking these guys. And watch what the text says. Bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, qualified to serve in the king's palace. And you teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. You assign them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years. Again, 3 years, and after that, they'll enter the king's service. What's happening? What's happening is Babylon is taking these 4 children of Israel and turning their identity inside out. They're not going to be Israelites anymore. They're going to be Babylonians. They're not going to speak Hebrew anymore. They're going to speak Akkadian. They're not going to live in Jerusalem anymore. They're going to serve in Babylon. They're not going to know the literature of ancient Israel. Now, they had been taught it as kids, and God thank you that they were. But they're now going to be taught Babylonian literature, Babylonian gods, Babylonian ways. I mean, everything about them is going to be changed, even their manhood. Sound familiar? Sounds what happens to some of us sometimes. Where we're born into Christian families, and then we're transformed to look like the world we live in. That's the battle they're facing. And among those who were chosen was some from Judah. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Isn't it fascinating that when we speak of these 4 children of Israel, we know Daniel's Jewish name, but we never call Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. We call them who? Meshach, Shadrach, Abednego. Right? That's their pagan names. That's their Babylonian names. You see, lesson number 1 is sometimes life is totally upended through no fault of our own. In other words, Daniel and his three friends find themselves in a world that is so alien to them. And they're like, what in the world is going on, God? And they didn't do it. I mean, they're teenagers. I mean, they had nothing to do with the fact that they're now in Babylon. They had nothing to do with, and by the way, neither do we oftentimes. I didn't choose to be born in Mississippi. That's where I was born. I didn't choose my mom and dad. But that's who I got. I didn't choose to be a man. But I was born a man. I mean, you just keep filling in the blanks. I didn't choose to be born in a lower middle class family, but that was the family I was born into. You see, there's a lot of things, y'all, that we cannot control about our identity, but that core part we can. And that's what this chapter is all about. Among those chosen, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. But right off the bat, Daniel, which means God is my judge. Hananiah, Yahweh has been gracious. Mishael, who is what God is. And Azariah, Yahweh has helped me. Every one of their names mentions the name of God of Israel. That's their core identity. But Nebuchadnezzar said, not anymore. From now on, you get new names. Daniel, you're going to become Belteshazzar. Hananiah, you're going to become Shadrach. Mishael, you're going to be Meshach. Azariah, you're going to be Abednego. And by the way, it's a change of their core identity. Daniel, God is my judge. Now he's Belteshazzar. Lady, which is probably the name of one of the female gods, protect the king. In other words, he's now named after the Babylonian gods. Hananiah, Yahweh's been gracious. You're now Shadrach, inspired of a coup. Another Babylonian god. Mishael, who is what God is. Now you're Meshach, who is as Aku is. Azariah, Yahweh has helped. Now you're Abednego. You're the servant of Nabu. That's who you're a servant of. Do you see the transformation? As Nebuchadnezzar is trying to take these guys and press them down into his mold and change everything about them, Satan is always attacking our core identity. That's what he goes after. I mean, if he can change our names, if he can change what we believe in, if he can change the culture we live in, I mean, Satan is constantly trying to do that. And y'all, we see it all around us. I mean, used to, when I was a kid, you never saw a phrase that says, I identify as. You never saw that. Now it's everywhere. I got behind I don't know what it was the other day. It was like Toyota, older Toyota model. And it had a bumper sticker on the back that says, I identify as a Mercedes. Yeah? I mean, I wish I'd had that when I was a teenager driving a Ford Pinto. I mean, I identify as a Mustang, you know. I mean, y'all, just because we identify doesn't mean that's who we are. And Daniel knew that. God created mankind in his image. That's the core of who we are right here. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. That's why Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, seek first the kingdom of God. Because that's where your identity is. So Daniel, who has lost everything. He's not with his family anymore. He's got 3 friends, but that's it. He's not in Jerusalem. He's in Babylon. He's not speaking Hebrew. He's speaking a foreign language. He is learning the literature of the Babylonians. He is a eunuch of all things. And so he decides, if I'm going to hold on to something, I've got to find something to keep my core identity. And he decided it'd be the food. So he resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And so he asked the chief official, he says, can us 4 not eat the food that you've got prepared for us? By the way, this food would have been sacrificed to the gods of Babylon. Daniel knew that. And so Daniel said, you know what? If we just go back to what we were taught as kids from the Pentateuch, Leviticus 11, clean versus unclean. If we can just start there. I mean, it's the only thing they could hold on to, y'all. They can't go to synagogue. There were no synagogues. They can't go to the temple. It's been burnt down. They can't read the Old Testament law. They had no scrolls. The only thing they had left was what they were taught as kids. And so Daniel and his 3 friends said, that's where we'll begin. And so he goes to the chief official and he asks him that. Now, what Daniel wants us to know in verse 9 is now God had caused the official, he liked Daniel. There was just something about Daniel. I mean, all of us have experienced that. We meet someone we've never met before, and within seconds we're like, you know what? I like this young lady. I like this young man. I mean, there's just something about their personality that you're attracted to. Well, that was the case here, except the reason behind it is because he's doing it. And John Micah, as we have repeated over and over this year, God is always at work. Sometimes unseen, sometimes in ways we don't notice, but he's always at work in our lives. And he was already at work. By the way, he was the one who caused Jehoiakim to say, I surrender. God delivered them up. God's working through all of this. But the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my Lord. I'm afraid of Nebuchadnezzar. He's the one who's assigned this food. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head. By the way, that's literal. He would have my head. So Daniel comes to him. And by the way, Satan is always at work behind the scenes as well. I mean, if God's at work, Satan's always at work. But the hope we have coming out of 1 John is the one who is in you is greater than the one who is in the world. That's what we've got to remember. Because even though Satan is at work, God is way ahead of him. And we need to understand that. And so Daniel simply says, would you just test us? Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. We went last week to Williamsburg, Virginia. We've been trying to take some little quick trips that have been on our bucket list for a while. And we ate really good while we were down in Williamsburg. And I told June when we went to the airport, I said, starting this evening, it's back to bread and water. Hold the bread. I mean, whoo, we have got to deal with this problem. That's basically Daniel. And he says, by the way, you just test us. And what he says is, you do it in 10 days. I don't know about y'all, but man, if I changed my eating habit, I don't think you'd see much in 10 days. But then again, Daniel knew God was behind it. And so he agreed. 10 days, I mean, what could harm in 10 days? And so for 10 days, he tested them. And at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. In other words, what's going on here? God is accomplishing his purposes. These 4 guys needed something to hang on to remind them who they were and who their God was. And God said, I'll bless you because of that. And so to these young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. Even this is a summary, y'all, of 3 years. Of 3 years. And basically what it says is, at the end of 3 years, guess who was on the honor roll every month? Guess who was in the beta club at the very top of the list? Guess who graduated the top 4 of all the University of Babylon? It's these 4 young men. Why? Because they trusted in God. God's going to supply your every need if you just ask him. Brothers and sisters, our greatest problem is we don't ask. I mean, you turn over to the book of James. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously. Look at that. And not just generously, to all without finding fault. I mean, that's what I love about this text. Is God, I mean, basically I go, hey God, I need more help. Well, I'd love to help you, but you got, look at the problems you've got over here. God doesn't do that. I think a lot of times that's what we think God does is, well, God would never bless me. I've just got too many problems. God doesn't find fault. And so at the end of the time, they are brought before Nebuchadnezzar. And y'all, I love how chapter 1 ends. The king talked with them. And he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, using their Jewish names. So they entered the king's servant, and in every matter of wisdom, understanding about the king, questioned them. He found them 10 times. Look at the language there. 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. You See, when God's on our side, y'all, it's not just doubling it, tripling it. 10 times He blesses us. And that's what we get from this wonderful book. And by the way, all because these 4 boys said we'll start with something as simple as the food we eat. We can't control much more, but we'll do our best to start there. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. That's what's amazing about Daniel, is the book is just so compact. But in reality, he went in 605 and stayed at least to 535 and probably a little beyond that. I mean, 70 years, which puts him around 85 years old. And he's still serving God as the Persians come in. You talking about a life well lived? That was the life of Daniel. And that's the life we're going to explore over the next several weeks. I'm just so excited about it. But y'all, the question you have to answer is the question we ask at the very beginning. Where's your identity found? I mean, is it in your job? Is it in your family? Is it in where you live? Is it in how much money you have in the bank? Is it in who you're married to? Is it what you can do? Or is it in God? Because if it's not in God, then you're as much an idolater as all the Israelites had become and the Babylonians were. That's what frustrated God so much. He said, it's time for you to put me at the center of your life. And Daniel and his 3 friends served as examples of young men who did exactly that. If you need to do it, we're here to help you. If you've never been baptized, if you've never put your faith in Jesus, saying, God, I want you to be the center of my life, we can help you today. If you have other needs, just come let us know what they are. You can do that right now as together we stand and sing.